Good evening everyone, and welcome to Policy Exchange. For those of you who don't know, my name is Guy Newey. I'm Head of Environment and Energy at Policy Exchange, and we're delighted to welcome you here for this debate this evening. 2 years ago, we published a report called Gasworks. This is a rather battered copy, there aren't many left. And I think it's fair to say 2 years ago, shale gas was a kind of relatively minor part of the policy debate. That is no longer the case and has become an increasingly fierce area of contention in energy policy in the UK and in Europe, even among those who are advocating action on climate change. Fracking has obviously had a transformative effect in the United States, both in terms of prices and to some extent emissions. But can the success be repeated in Europe? Are we too densely packed in to allow exploration? Will tougher environmental legislation make it too expensive? What will be the impact if we do explore on prices? And will it mean the end of Europe's, or at least curtailing of Europe's climate ambitions? Shale gas exploration has faced moratoria, perhaps, in several European countries, and there is discussion of increasing legislation from the Commission. Tonight we're hoping to explore many of these issues, tease out some of the details, and we have the ideal panel to discuss them. I'll do a brief introduction and then we'll get into the opening statements. So, Lord Brown and Mattingly has a long and distinguished career at BP, rising from a university apprentice in 1966 to becoming Group CEO in 95. He's currently partner of Riverstone Holdings, as well as, most relevant perhaps for this debate, chairman of Quadrilla. He's also close to the policy-making process, holds the position of lead non-exec board member for the UK government. Presumably that means you can sack the Prime Minister if required. No, perhaps not. He also led work on the Brown Report, which is a review of higher education, which has led to many of the reforms that we've seen the coalition taking up. Last year he published his book, 7 Elements That Have Changed the World, which includes a discussion of carbon, which is very relevant to today's debate. Our second speaker will be Jason Anderson, who's head of EU climate and energy policy at WWF, the environmental NGO. Jason coordinates WWF's response to European policy developments. He's based in Brussels. He's been involved in far too many working groups and advisory bodies for me to name. Prior to that, he was lead author on the IPCC's special reports on ozone and climate interactions and on CCS. Before that, he worked at the think tank, or worked as part of the think tank that's based just around the corner, the Institute for European Environmental Policy. And our last speaker is Professor Dieter Helm. He's well known to Policy Exchange, including as an author of several of our reports. He's one of the UK's leading economists with a particular expertise and passion for energy and environment issues. Brief highlights: he assisted the EC in preparing the 2050 roadmap and has been a special advisor to at various points to the outgoing Commissioner on Energy, author of many books, most recently, The Carbon Crunch. You haven't written, Dieter's normally written 2 or 3 by the time you, in the intervening periods, but The Carbon Crunch, which we talked about several months ago here. This event is part of a series that Policy Exchange is doing with the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University. For those of you who don't know the Smith School, it was a body set up by Sir Martin Smith. It's now headed by Gordon Clark, and the school is doing outstanding work on issues around business markets, climate and energy, and I'd highly recommend their website to find out more. So the format of this evening is each speaker will speak for around 7 or 8 minutes. They've been given strict instructions to stick to that, and that should allow us plenty of time to open up to questions from the floor. For those of you who are impatient to get into the debate, the Twitter hashtag is PXShale. And I'd like to introduce Lord Brown to speak first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great privilege, actually, to be here. The first time I've been to Policy Exchange. It has a very distinguished background, and I'm honored to be here. I will try not to indulge in what is, I think, an old saying, which is a new saying around London. It is to do with Lloyd Webber's recent new musical about the Profumo affair. I really don't want people to say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? And then you can, of course, then say, I have no comment on that. But I'll try and say something which is a bit different. I have to start by saying, of course, shale gas can be a part of an extraordinarily good solution to Europe's energy and climate challenges. There is, in my mind, no doubt about that. It's abundant, low carbon, and can provide a reliable baseload power to complement renewable energy. It provides a positive balance of payments. It provides jobs. It could provide jobs, new centres of technology, and indeed could, for Europe and the UK, back out rather more expensive LNG. So as you might expect, I'm convinced about the benefits this industry can bring, and we can discuss those more in detail later. But what I'd like to talk about tonight is something which I could just simply summarize as a single version of the truth. I'd like to talk about information and how we can move forward the debate on a more factual basis. I think a shale gas industry will need companies to work productively and in consultation with the communities in which they operate. And in the absence of accurate information about onshore operations, this is going to be very hard. I think it's also going to be very hard for regulators, because I think this requires really good and intelligent regulation. Regulators need to base regulations on which are responsive to the realities of information. In my experience, I've been talking about this around the world. There are plenty of places where there's a lot of confusion about information. I pick half a dozen. Shale gas will lock us into a fossil fuel future. Fracking contaminates water supplies. Fracking causes earthquakes. Fracking uses toxic and carcinogenic chemicals. Fracking causes droughts, and fracking will industrialize the countryside. I'm just going to pick two of these points, if I may, and leave the others either on the table or something for later. To do with first the position of gas in the energy mix. I like to think of it as follows. I think we have to think of carbon budgets like a diet. You set yourself a limit, for example, of 2,000 calories a day, and to fill that carbon budget, you could, of course, just eat ice cream, or you could eat a balanced diet. At the moment, Europe is consuming an increasing amount of coal and renewable energy. It's like eating a lot of salad and then finishing with several scoops of ice cream. Instead, I think the mix needs to be rebalanced. Providing that domestically produced gas displaces coal and imported gas from the energy mix, then it can help Europe meet its carbon dioxide reduction emissions targets. Gas, as you probably most know, has a CO2 footprint which is 10% lower than imported LNG and fully 50% lower than coal. And in America, interestingly, in the US, and I have direct experience on this, shale gas development has coincided with a huge increase in renewable energy capacity. So there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that shale gas has diverted resources from renewables. And the only way that Europe can meet its climate obligations, I would suggest, is to take full account and full advantage of shale gas resources. Let me talk about the second, which is water supplies. I often try to wonder why it is that people are talking so much about this, and I think part of it is the movie Gasland, which did try to link flaming taps with hydraulic fracturing. It made for an exciting documentary, but one which probably wasn't based on fact, as was found out much later. The State of Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission did its own investigation and found out that 2 of the 3 cases indicated, and I think this is much more general in application, were to do with biogenic methane, methane naturally present in water. In the 3rd case, methane came from a hydraulic fracturing, but not as a result of the hydraulic fracturing, but simply as a result of bad cementing of the pipe that produced the gas. There are plenty of other researches, but it seems to me that none of these have come up with real evidence, or with evidence, that gas came from wells that were fractured, but merely came from existing sources, natural sources. Shales generally in Europe are well away from any water table, any aquifer. They're much, much deeper and can easily be protected from the aquifer itself. Finally, just on water, there's a lot of discussion about just how much water consumption is used in developing shale gas. There are plenty of estimates. I think it's reasonable to assume that it certainly is one of the lowest consumers of water. Coal, for example, uses 8 times the amount of water that shale gas uses in its production cycle. And indeed, in the production phase nowadays, water used in fracking is recycled itself. There are plenty of other facts and figures, but I've run out of time.
As somebody who likes a salad followed by ice cream, I'm not sure if I'm the right person. Jason, up to you.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you to Policy Exchange for the invitation to join the distinguished panel. It's a very rich discussion, and I also will have to limit myself to only a few subjects. I would be remiss in not beginning the intervention here coming from an environmental NGO and focusing on climate change and energy, not to point out the scale of the climate change challenge in front of us. If, as was just pointed out, we imagine that we have a carbon budget that we can expend and still stay below 2 degrees of global warming, which is the internationally agreed limit, then we have about 500 billion tons of carbon that we can still emit. We're emitting about 1/10 of that amount per year right now. So in other words, if we want to have an economy beyond 10 years from now, we're going to have to rapidly reduce those emissions year on year. The problem with respect to fossil fuels has been identified by the International Energy Agency, which is that we have far more fossil fuels in the ground and can be extracted than we can actually combust and stay below these limits. So our challenge with respect to coal, gas, and oil writ large is not how to find out ways of getting more out, but how to find ways of keeping more down. The IEA, for example, has estimated that we need to keep about 80% of currently proven coal reserves in the ground and almost half of currently proven natural gas reserves in the ground if we want to have something like a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees warming. So we're a global organization. We work in about 100 countries, and everywhere you go that have fossil fuel resources, you hear the same argument, which is, in our country, that's different. In our country, there's a good reason for extracting fossil fuels. Whether that's in Norway or Canada, which are environmentally responsible, or West Africa, where it's necessary for development. The question is, where do you draw the line? Who is it that decides that we keep those fossil fuels in the ground? And fortunately, we're having a rich and interesting debate about that in Europe, of which this is part. Now, in this context, our priorities as an organization are clear. They are to stop coal and to increase the efficiency with which we use energy. So I'm going to start talking about gas by talking about coal, because that's our priority. We are becoming quite successful at stopping new coal facilities from being built. more are being decommissioned. We have net decommissioning of new coal. The problem is with existing coal and the lifetime extension and the overuse of existing coal, including some governments that are willing to subsidize it in order to keep it going or to build new capacity. The campaign we've been running this year, Seize Your Power, has been working on the finance side of the equation. I think that we have had some success working with the European Investment Bank in shifting away from coal for instituting, for example, an emissions performance standard and a shadow carbon price that is higher than it used to be, and also working with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in getting them away from coal. So the question then becomes, if we're making some progress, slow but some progress in dealing with coal, what is the appropriate role for gas? And if we talk about shale gas, we need to divide that question into two separate things. There's a conversation about gas, and then there's a conversation about shale gas as such. So when it comes to gas, clearly there's an important role for gas in the decarbonization of European energy supply. It's highly preferable to use gas than to use coal, and it's important for balancing renewable energy, for example. I'll return to that in a moment. The secondary question is, what's the role for shale gas? If one wants shale in a particular country for a particular reason, which might involve economic development, it might involve security of supply, that's a separate issue and it needs to be tackled on its own merits. Most assessments show that European levels of shale gas extraction are unlikely to affect gas prices and markets, and that any industrial and development, therefore, needs to be taken into account what the benefits of that might be against the disbenefits, and those disbenefits have to do with the environmental impacts, whether local or global, and the economic benefits of an alternative energy pathway. And secondly, with respect to shale, as is true with gas, but it has, with all gas, but it has some particular characteristics, methane emissions and controlling those are very important. And there's quite a range of experience from North America that needs to be taken into consideration. And of course, there are local environmental impacts, which I wouldn't downplay and which are important to many people, and I'll return to that in a moment. So we say that there's a narrow window for the role of gas in a decarbonizing Europe. If you account for the fact that it will take time, if you want to develop shale gas, for that industry to come online, it might actually start to peak around 2030. That is a year by which Europe should largely have decarbonized its power supply, including in the UK. So I have some serious doubts, and we have doubts about what the role of a built-out gas infrastructure will be at a point in which you need to rapidly decarbonize. And I think the example of coal is instructive here. As I've mentioned, we have transitional national plans which are extending the life of coal. We have some exemptions that are being sought for coal. I find it highly unlikely that a very robust gas infrastructure will be built and then magically turned off and switched to some other form of energy in a couple of decades. Now, shale gas is motivating citizens around Europe, but I think probably for the wrong reasons. It's leaving people alienated, it's leaving people confused, it's leaving people concerned about their local environmental impacts. But importantly, also from a broader perspective, is that they don't understand whether or not they are being led by industry and government into a decarbonization pathway through fossil fuels. It's confusing. And it demotivates the public in what is essentially a very large social movement towards decarbonization. And you could say that for shale gas, you don't have what the IEA calls a social license to operate. It has social resistance. And what we need now in order to rapidly decarbonize is to get behind a vision that actually achieves that in very short order. There are ways of addressing some of the concerns around local environmental impact, but unfortunately, we're not using the regulatory tools at our disposal. Certainly at the EU level, there are a number of relevant regulations. The European Parliament and the European Commission have previously said that these need to be amended or there needs to be a new regulation put in place. The problem is that last week the European Commission came out with a recommendation. That recommendation is therefore not binding across member states, and you will have probably very widely differing application around Europe. That application will lead to different costs. The Commission estimates that full application would cost about 1.6% of revenue. but lack of application would cost nothing. Now, this clearly creates distortions in the energy market, which is exactly what the European Union was designed in the first place to avoid. So European regulation certainly seems in order here. And I have to state that in light of our concerns about the role of gas in an energy transition, it has to occur within a very robust set of legislation and policy directions around carbon limitations. And again, last week, the European Commission came out with recommendations about 2030, and robust is not the word I would use to characterize it. As proposed, it is simply inadequate to drive out coal, to favor gas in the short term, and to lead to a decarbonized Europe in the longer term. And I have to mention in this context, for example, the European emissions trading system, which is meant to be the flagship in order to reach its reductions, is currently oversupplied by on the order of 2 gigatons of CO2. Those 2 gigatons of CO2 will not be removed by the proposal that the Commission put out last week. And therefore, we are not likely to have a policy framework within Europe that motivates a decarbonization of the energy system and actually heightens our concerns about the role of gas in that framework. And we're hoping that the European Council will be more robust in its reply on the 20th and 21st of March. Thank you very much.
There's plenty of discussion of lock-in and EU climate policy, which I'm sure we'll get into in the discussion. Dieter.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you to the Policy Exchange, and thank you to the Smith School. I should say I'm an associate of the Smith School, so I have a particular interest in that. In my 6 or 7 minutes, and bearing in mind what 2 previous speakers have said, much of which I agree with, I thought that it would be helpful to just remind us of some of the global facts on the ground, to remind ourselves what a complete shambles European energy policy is. It's quite a remarkable achievement that when you're trying to pursue security and decarbonisation and affordability stroke competitiveness, it's quite an achievement to fail on one, but to fail on all 3 is quite a unique event in the history of energy policy. And I want to say a few words about how we've got into that kind of mess. And then if I have time, I'll make some remarks about some of the environmental issues in respect of shale gas and some of the principles that we should apply in developing shale gas, the extent that it can meet those principles and the extent it has a role to play. So let's just start at the global level. At the global level, emissions are now rising about 3 parts per million. There is no blip in the growth of emissions since 1990. No impact from the European exercise so far on global emissions. Many countries in Europe are increasing their carbon consumption while reducing their carbon production. We've been deindustrialising. The global scale, coal burn's gone to nearly 30% of world primary energy, and about 3 coal power stations come on a week in China and India put together. And even in the latest plan, Chinese 5-year plan, to the extent you should believe such GOS plans, there will be another 400 to 600 gigawatts of coal on the world system by 2020, which is the date at Durban we agreed that we might try in 2015 to agree what we might do about it. So any notion that we're on a decarbonisation path, we're a million miles from that. It's also true that despite the statements from ministers and all sorts of officials over the last 5 or 6 years, shale gas has transformed the world's energy system together with shale oil. We now know, if we didn't know already, that peak oil and peak gas is just nonsense. We have enough oil and gas to fry the planet many times over. We're not going to run out of oil anytime soon. We're not going to run out of gas, and we're not going to run out of coal. And there's no reason to believe that the oil and gas price are going to go ever upwards and make the windmills and solar panels economic. That's not necessarily going to happen. There's at least as good chance that these prices are going south rather than north. And just add in Iran and Iraq, both at some stage in the future, 10, 15, 20 years' time, producing 10 million barrels a day of oil each, and you start to see that even in the conventional space, there's tons of this stuff. Shale gas is affecting the UK. It's not that it's providing direct supplies from the United States to us. It has changed world prices. They would be different in the absence of the US shale gas, oil prices similarly. And of course, the major effect has come through the product market. Shale gas is being turned into product in the United States. You can see it through the petrochemical industry, right through Europe, the refineries and elsewhere. You can see the impacts. We are being affected by this transformational change in the United States, which of course the peak oil people thought would be in a completely different position. And that brings me to Europe. The delusion in Europe about windmills and current generation solar panels was based on the notion that the politicians knew in the mid-years of the last decade that the oil and gas price was going to go ever upwards. Since it was going to go ever upwards, it was a very sensible thing to get out of oil and gas, to build these renewables, because however expensive they might be now, by 2020, these things were going to be competitive. And lest you doubt me, I've researched the statements by the politicians and many of the people in this period. Now, while this was all going on, and with the certain knowledge that the Americans would be stuck with all that very expensive oil and gas imports it would need, while Europe would be basking in its cheap energy after 2020 from its renewable industries, and presumably the petrochemical industries will be flocking to places like Aberdeen to get access to the cheap offshore wind. I joke not. The world changed dramatically. That delusion is not anymore possible to sustain, and the renewables that we've currently got are going to need to be subsidised for a very, very long time into the future. The subsidies are permanent, not transient, and we have to think about how in Europe to construct our world where the world energy price is lower than we imagined, there is abundant fossil fuels, and prices are out there to be competed against. So what's Europe done? Well, the champion of climate change in Europe, the leader of the Green Revolution, is supposed to be the Germans. Now, I can take liberty, being half German myself, to be rude about Germany, but let me make some observations. A country that cares about climate change has decided the risk of a tsunami going up the Rhine and reaching Munich is so serious that it should close down its base zero-carbon energy quickly, taking off a number of stations immediately and closing all the rest. Not about new build, it's about highly regulated current power stations which are perfectly capable of producing zero carbon or near zero carbon emissions being closed instantly. What do they replace them with? Tell you what, let's replace it with coal. And you couldn't make this up. Then let's go from gas to coal, and let's expand our lignite coal base to be the largest producer of lignite in the world, the dirtiest stuff known to mankind. Oh, and by the way, let's add 7 or 8 gigawatts of new coal power stations to the system. No doubt, not only, no surprise, not only is it the case that their carbon production, their carbon consumption is rising, but their carbon production is now rising at 2% a year as well. This is greenery, Europe style. It's a climate disaster, and I have every sympathy with the view that the target should be coal, coal, and coal as the first priority. But just to finish it off, although we're going to promote coal, and in this country we've gone from 28% to 40% coal in our coal burn, in Europe, particularly Germany, we think that effectively we should ban shale gas. Right? Now, I've got some sympathy in certain circumstances that you should really be very, very careful about developing shale gas. But just compare shale gas with coal. Now, shale gas leaks some methane, as does conventional gas. It will cause some migration leakage, and there'll be some wellhead leakage. It uses water. And it uses some chemicals, all of which we should be very careful about. But let's compare it with coal. Coal mines spew out methane. Coal mines are always, not always, but often right in the middle of the water table. They leak out heavy metals. Their coal mining is fantastically energy intensive. It damages the health of everyone who goes down the coal mine. It needs transporting to a power station. It leaks emissions from the stack outside the power station. It produces SOx and NOx when it's burnt. And it uses a phenomenal amount of water, not only in the coal mining, but also in the power station itself. And then you get rid of the ash. It's incredible that a country like Germany thinks on the one hand you can promote coal, and on the other hand ban fracking. It's nonsense. Anyone who thinks you should ban fracking should make coal mining illegal. That is the consistent position to go to. And that's the opposite of what's happening in a number of European countries. Now, I could go on about the effects on competitiveness, about what other people are doing, what's happening elsewhere. But that's some principal bits. I've got 1 minute, I think, up there on my clock. I've been watching it extremely closely. Thank you. But I take the point. So when it comes to developing shale gas, is it the solution? No. Is it part of the solution? In some cases, it has a contribution to make. Has environmental effects? These need to be regulated. Polluters need to pay, and pollution from methane leakage from coal mines should be paid for. It should be paid for from gas wells, and water usage, I'd like water to be priced. Should be taken into account, but on a consistent basis with the other fossil fuels. The landscape issues, there are certain areas where you really shouldn't have this kind of stuff in the landscape for landscape reasons. Like you shouldn't have windmills in beautiful locations too, on the same ground. There are issues for all the fuels. We don't know what the volumes are. We should drill some holes and find out. That gives us an opportunity to think what's going forward. And the impacts on renewables, actually the idea that shale gas is going to wipe out renewables, I think if you look at the costs of the existing renewables as opposed to future renewables, they do it for themselves. And that leads to kind of 2 or 3 principles. First is we should price and regulate properly on a consistent basis across the fossil fuels. Secondly, we should embrace the compensation principle. Any development that has impacts should pay the consequences of those impacts. And thirdly, much more importantly, we should get serious about climate change, realise that the current generation of windmills and solar panels can't crack the problem, and get on with the future renewables like future solar, like geothermal, like applying IT to the networks, like storage, like batteries, and get serious about applying money to things that might make a difference and do something to compete with those fossil fuels. Thank you.
Plenty of food for thought there from Dieter. Look, Brian, can I just come back on one point? The point that I thought Jason made very well, which is the point that with the scale of the environmental challenge, which is climate change, surely any effort we have should be focused on things that don't have any carbon content at all, or very limited.
I suppose in an ideal world that would be right, but it can't be so. And I say that on the basis of a great amount of experience. I'm the head of the world's largest clean fund, the Renewable Energy Fund. And I noticed that you can invest in some places and you can't invest in others. You can't rely on things being as they are when you start. Things get changed. So I think you can begin to add low carbon technology everywhere, that's for sure. But you have to get the price right, you have to get the regulations right, you have to get the technology right. Meanwhile, you can actually develop gas to add to it. And I think however you slice and dice carbon budgets and look at the different numbers, I think you could burn an awful lot of gas and still limit the amount of carbon going to the atmosphere. You really could. So it seems to me that's very important. If I can add one other point, is everybody says that they're different when it comes to energy. Actually, they are, because the amount of resources they have are different, their economy is different, their desires for energy security, for competitiveness, they're all different. So these decisions remain, I believe, very nationally driven. And it is in the national interest of the United Kingdom, I believe, to do something which is good for the UK. And it has to then fit it into a bigger picture. The US has done this, and I find it extraordinary that we would then say, in order to step to one side to allow the US and others to do things even better, that we wouldn't actually look after ourselves. I think it's a national imperative. It's something which is about being a nation that's quite important.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions. I ask that when the microphone comes to you, that you identify who you are, organisation you're from, and please keep your questions relatively brief. I will cut you off. Right, who'd like to go first? That lady on the side there.
Thank you very much to the speakers. It was very interesting. I'm Samuela Basse from the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. As I think all of you said that there is some merit in replacing at least coal with gas in the short term. I think you also all agree that we have long-term targets and to meet if we are serious about climate change. And given that there might be then a risk of stranded assets and investing heavily in gas now, isn't there an argument there in investing in technologies to cap emissions of, and I'm talking about CCS in this case, if investment in shale gas is to be done? So, you know, either banning everything or if allowing more fossil fuels to come up in the future, then think about a technology to reduce emissions. Thank you.
So this is a lock-in question, if I get...
Lock-in and carbon capture and storage. So
Okay.
is it worth investing in carbon capture and storage as well as on shale gas, if this is the road that one wants to follow?
Okay, we'll go to Jason first and then Dieter.
Thanks for the question. I would first take issue with characterizing what was said as replacing coal with gas. We need to replace coal, and there's a number of options to do that, starting with being more efficient, and that gives you much more flexibility than with your other options. The European Commission, when it did its 2050 roadmap, had a number of different scenarios, one of which was heavily reliant on carbon capture and storage, and therefore allowed 1.5 trillion euros worth of fossil fuel generation to be put on the system between now and 2050. And therefore, it played a very large gamble about the efficacy of CCS to remove those emissions over time. And we find that a very risky pathway. If you want to have gas over the medium to long term, then it has to have CCS, but you have to balance the risk of planning for that in the future against what you could alternatively do. And admittedly, there are a number of different pathways you could choose, but we find a lower risk pathway would be to focus on efficiency and renewable energy and not gamble on the commercialization of CCS. Now, the recent European Parliament paper on this issue said that if you don't support CCS, in which case you could question what else could you support with that money, but if you don't support CCS, then you have to have an emissions performance standard at European level, because that is the only thing that would drive it into the market.
Is that on the CCS and lock-in in particular?
Yeah, a couple of things. On CCS, I doubt it's going to be a panacea. There are all sorts of issues to address in how this technology might work. But you know, if you take the aggregate and all the bits and pieces, 100 billion into the offshore wind business, and you can't find 1 billion to experiment with a CCS to see if the technology will work. This is just fundamental misbalance of resources, given that consumers have a limited amount of money that they're prepared to devote to these activities, whether you like it or not. It's just, you know, it's shallow water, we've got lots of empty gas holes, we've got coal power stations nearby. You know, it's a no-brainer. If you're going to spend that scale of money on technologies which are always going to be fantastically expensive, we're never going to have, you know, offshore wind farms at 80 or 90 pounds per megawatt hour, let alone, you know, 50, 60. So, yeah, do it. The other thing to say is, and it's a very important point in which you raised, this point about stranded assets. Okay? The worst world is to just make it really uncertain what you're going to do in policy terms. Okay? So the private sector will invest in these things or not, and when we have the capacity auctions, people will build gas stations, but they want to know, how long can I run it for? What are you going to close it down? Are you going to use EPS? Are you going to impose CCS? You decide. That's how we've killed off new coal stations, right, by essentially doing EPS in that frame. So we need to make that framework clear. However, you know, if you said, you know, basically you're going to have to close it in 2030, well, pretty economic to build one now. You don't need 10 years to depreciate a gas plant. It's in the nature of the beast. And remember, what's the alternative? Now, it'd be nice to live in a world where we had a state plan and governments told us exactly what to do and we were going to follow the path and politicians would never deviate, okay? Reality in Germany is, instead of building gas plants, we're building coal plants. And they're going to be just as locked in, okay? So clear rules and a clear CCS experiment, but don't get terribly excited about CCS anytime soon. And there's a volume issue. The volume of the gas is bigger than the stuff that comes out the carbon, and there aren't enough holes to make a difference to parts per million emissions globally.
I want to follow up. I suppose since I'm the only businessman on the panel, I should speak as a businessman. It seems to me that business is the only mechanism for actual delivery of most of this. And so I'm with Dieter in this one point, which is if you want to reduce carbon, then you should set a proper price for carbon, and one which is set in a way which is transparent and clear and is sustainable for the future as the market develops. That will do wonders to all sorts of rebalancing, for starters. Secondly, I think it will then push the technologies in the right direction. CCS was a very interesting idea. I tried to mount the very first CCS project in the United Kingdom. I couldn't get, there's a gap between what it would cost and what we could afford, and so it didn't happen. Actually, there are very few places, I think, in the world where CCS can be made to work. It requires very special circumstances to do with the reservoir in which the CO2 goes in, and very special circumstances in getting the CO2 to the reservoir. So I think while I wouldn't rule it out, I certainly wouldn't rule it in. It's not something which should feature strongly. I think assets will be stranded or not stranded, but they won't all happen at once. And I think we tend to think about things stopping at a certain moment, going on and stopping. That never happens. I would suggest, regrettably, that won't happen with coal plants. It won't happen with old power stations. It's amazing that they tend to come and go, and they tend to last longer and be used in different ways as time goes by. Assets haven't been stranded yet, and I don't expect they will be stranded in great amounts in the future.
Okay, hands are going to start going up. Fiona first, and I'll come to you next. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Microphone.
Thank you very much. Fiona Harvey from The Guardian. Thank you for the interesting talks, but the question I want to ask is, when we have sort of new fuels like shale gas, the evidence seems to be that we don't abandon the old fuels. So if you look at what has happened globally in terms of coal, then we're using more coal now globally than at any point since the 60s. In Europe, we're burning coal like there's no tomorrow, and that's because so much of it has been displaced from the US. So, and BP did a study, its Global Energy Outlook last week, suggested that even with a massive use of shale gas, which will displace some coal, we will still see emissions rise by nearly a third by 2035. Now, that's going to fry us, really. So I'd like to know, how you kill coal, if you really think that gas can kill coal, how that would happen. I'd also like to ask, and I'd like to direct this particularly at Professor Helm and perhaps Lord Brown might like to have a view as well. In the UK at the moment, we are not only are we not building new gas plants, we are still mothballing existing gas plants. So how does that work? We're burning more coal than we have for years, and we're mothballing the gas plants we have.
Dieter?
Thanks, Fiona. I hope your newspaper will recognise I'm not a gas maniac, as you described in your paper. It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. But anyway, and neither am I George Osborne's closest political advisor, which was you. You did it. I've been wanting to say that for a very long time. Anyway, put that aside. Okay, so the crucial point you make is, first of all, that just because we've got gas doesn't mean we aren't going to burn more coal. It seems to me that's so far correct, but that's because the drivers for coal coal burn around the world are very large, and there isn't much shale gas. Right? The only place there's shale gas is the United States, nowhere else. Okay? China isn't using shale gas. It's just powering its economic growth. It's doubling its economy every 10 years, and it's based on coal. It's going to squeeze the coal a bit back to 63%. But once you've doubled an economy, 63% is a large number, and that's where you get this 400 to 600 gigawatts of more coal. Okay? So it's at the margin and not generally. So the question is, in climate change terms, and here one of many I hope, but one area we really agree about. If you care about climate change, and you think that you've got to slow down that emissions growth at the global level, it's coal, coal, coal. And everything else is for the birds in the short run. And that's what I tried to explain in my book. Now, why is the coal burn going up in Europe? Europe's a small bit part in this thing. You're not going to solve global warming in England or in Europe. It's going to be solved in other territories. We've just got our contribution to worry about. How do you solve it? Well, first of all, you have to have a carbon price. Right? The reason people can burn all this coal is because they're not paying for the pollution that coal causes. And the EU ETS is an excuse for a carbon price. You want a long-term, stable and rising carbon price. The EU ETS produces a short-term, volatile and low price, which suits all the vested interests. Okay? The only way you're going to have a rising price through time is to have a carbon tax, and backloading and all those kind of mechanisms are basically backdoor ways of trying to fix the price because you don't like the output of the market you've discovered. Okay? Are the Europeans prepared to have an appropriate carbon price to make the adjustment? No. No evidence whatsoever that they're politically willing to do that. And so they'd rather build windmills in the North Sea, pretending they're doing something about climate change, and have a low carbon price which allows the coal burn to go up. And I could add to that, by the way, the EU ETS, of course, allows the reduction in renewables to create more scope under the emissions so that you can increase the coal burn to exactly offset the renewables you put on the system. You couldn't make this up, and I haven't got to the corruption yet either in the frame. Okay? So you need a carbon price. You've got to get the spark spread right. Okay? And that's what we have to focus on. If you won't do that, and you won't do the efficient thing, the only other option you've got is to use emissions performance standards, regulation, etc. And that's the second best. That's what we've done here in Britain. That's why Kingsnorth eventually didn't happen, and that's why we're not building coal stations here. They're not doing that in Europe, and that's the route we have to go down. It will cost. And as I always try to say, there are two rules of energy policy which are being cruelly exposed at the moment. The first is that no energy policy works if the customers can't pay. And secondly, no energy policy works if even if the customers can pay, they won't volunteer to vote for politicians who force them to pay. And that's the disaster of the dash for the really expensive current renewables at the expense of future renewables and expense of addressing the core problem, which in Europe at the moment is coal.
Jason, do you want to respond to some of those points?
I would just point out that this phenomenon that you highlight has been well researched by the IEA. They have a golden age of gas a scenario where they show that a high shale gas, high CCS scenario still leads you to a 3.5 degree world.
Yeah.
So you have to ask, what are your alternatives there? Again, we start with energy savings as being the most important way to increase the flexibility of your energy supply. But the focus on zero carbon energy, on renewable energy, has to be there in order to overcome this phenomenon of just adding more fossil fuels rather than having replacement. So yes, we do need to get rid of coal, but if we replace coal by gas, we're only getting halfway there. And if you imagine that you're going to get halfway there for only a decade or two and then get rid of the gas, then you're playing a very high stakes game. And I think that we see the same facts and come to different conclusions about the ability, for example, as Laura Brown just mentioned, once you've developed an industry like the coal industry, they're very reluctant to stop doing what they're doing.
Well,
And so I think we're much better served by I'm far more sanguine about the cost reductions in renewable energy than Dieter Helm is. And even the European Commission's impact assessment from last week's policy papers was already completely out of date the moment the ink was dry. So I think these cost reductions are actually going to be driven forward in a number of technologies that will help us get there, primarily with zero carbon energy like renewable energy.
If I may just add, I think we have to try many of these things, because coal will not go away by itself. I mean, it's gone away in America quite simply because of cost, and also a limited amount of regulation to do with not CO2, but other forms of emission, which are very expensive to cure. So it's moving it, and that's not going to happen in many places in the world, I don't think, unless we have a proper price for carbon, either through taxes or markets in one way or the other. And that's why, of course, that's why gas plants shut down. When it's too expensive to buy the gas to make the electricity, the spark spread goes wrong, they shut. It's very simple. Unless you do something else, the market will govern what's dispatched and what's not dispatched.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time. I'm going to take the one gentleman there and then one in front. I will come to everyone.
My name's Gordon Hunting and I'm an energy analyst in the stock exchange. Can I say something about one of the statements I took down from Mr. Jason Anderson? He said that shale gas had no effect on gas prices yet in UK markets. Well, it's halved the price of gas in US markets, which is the only place where it's already happened. So give shale a chance, and therefore we might get the economic benefits, which he seems to forget about.
Okay, and then Jonathan in front of you. Yep.
Hi there. Jonathan Leake, I'm the environment editor from the Sunday Times. Two hopefully quick questions, one for Lord Brown, which is, you mentioned the idea of sensitive regulators. I wondered what that would look like and who you could cite. Separately, there's been a lot of false dawns in energy. If you look back in the last decade or two, you've had planting trees as a way of getting rid of CO2. Remember that? We had the nuclear renaissance in about 2005, and we're still not much further. We've had geoengineering, much touted by politicians, carbon capture and storage. The list can go on. What makes shale gas different? And what do you think of the quality of the political debate and the politicians that are driving that whole idea?
Lord Brown, about sensitive regulators.
I must just be very sensitive about regulators. I think you missed out a word. I said sensitive to information. And I think that's really quite important. They may not be sensitive, but they need to be sensitive to information. The point I want to make here is this. I think this debate would be helped enormously if we could find a completely independent group of people to begin to sort myth from truth, truth from myth here. Because there is a lot of data on the effects of this, that, and the other to do with shale gas. And that needs to be sorted out somehow by someone we could perhaps trust. And that won't be someone who has a vested interest in it like me, and it won't necessarily be a politician who wants to get their way or not get their way. There needs to be some other way of doing it, and I think that might be a more modern approach to the debate. It's been done in different areas for different things, so this might be a way of solving that problem. I think shale gas is different because it's gas. It's not something that is as unusual as planting trees. That may work, incidentally. I mean, I think it does absorb CO2.
I think that's still the case.
But CCS was again, may work, but it may not work at the scale. No one, I think it sort of took off from the facts to the impressions that if you could make it work in one place, maybe, today London, tomorrow the world, as it were. And so I think these were hijacked away from perhaps the facts and the reality. Shale gas is working in the United States of America. The question here, a very good point, that we need to find out what is the capacity outside the United States for the development of shale gas. We're all talking about some assumptions here. The reality in the United Kingdom, for example, is we need to drill probably 20 to 40 wells, we need to frack them, we need to analyze the information, and then we'll probably know roughly what we've got. And I think looking at what's happened in North America, you could say this is not ephemeral, it's something which is real.
Just on one of those points you raised about the need for kind of independent voices in this. There's obviously parts of the government which are championing shale gas quite aggressively and keen supporters of that. As a businessman, is that helpful for you or not?
It's not a relevant question because it is what it is. It is.
That is a businessman's answer.
Absolutely not. One thing business doesn't do is stop governments doing things. When they decide to do it, they do it. So in the ideal, what I'd like to do is I'd like to do things in a way which make sense, which try and put a rational case in front of people. The leadership of governments is sometimes helpful, sometimes not. It depends entirely.
Nicely put. Jason, just on that issue on prices, actually, if you could.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I misspoke. What I meant to say was that there are no studies projecting that there will be an impact on prices once it goes to the scale. So the point is that the amount of shale gas at a cost that is going to have an impact on market prices that you could get from Europe is significantly different to what we're seeing in North America. And of course, this is still largely speculation, but the experience that has been gained so far is actually revised estimates downward rather than upward. So the point I'm making is let's make sure we have a distinction between gas and the supply of gas, of which at a global level there is enough, in fact, as we've seen, much more than enough, and the justification for shale gas as such in Europe.
Is that, hold on, sorry, hold on. Is that right, Dieter?
Well, I think we have to be very sort out this price thing because there are the most ludicrous propositions flying around about what shale gases can do to prices. Okay, it is true that shale gas has dramatically lowered the price of gas in the United States. So far, that the ratio of gas prices, of energy prices between the US and China is about as positive to the US as the labour cost advantages are to China. It changes the terms of trade. Why is that possible? Because gas isn't traded very much out of the United States. So it's its own market. There's hardly any exports, a limited amount of imports, and so supply and demand determines the price in the US. It's true that if you take an economy that's 25% of the world economy out of the international gas market, even if the Japanese decide to close 40 or 50 nuclear reactors and replace them with gas in the short run, the world price didn't go up. And that says it's so big to take the US out of the world market that you have changed the world market price from what it otherwise would have been. If Algeria and Argentina and the Middle East and everybody else, Russia, etc., develops their shale gas resources, the world price will fall. Now come to Britain. Britain is a small island interconnected with Europe. When we had our gas bubble at the end of the 90s, prices did fall here. But then the interconnectors came in and the price equalises because in an interconnected market there'll be a common price. That's why a big boost in shale production in the UK, provided it can reach market, will not change the European price much unless it's a big volume. It will normalise across. And if Europe were to develop the shale gas it's got, then the European price would fall. And that's the critical issue. The real impact of shale gas in Europe would probably be on busting Gazprom's contracts even more. Because we don't have world price gassing. We have oil index contracts with Gazprom, and that really would make a difference, and that's quite substantive. But that's the price issue. But Algeria is probably bigger than the United States. There's lots of other stuff around. Just think fluidly about how this may play out. But to say we're suddenly going to have cheap gas in Britain, this is the worst way of developing an energy resource. And that comes to Jonathan's question, what's special about it? Well, in one sense, nothing at all. It's just a fossil fuel. It's got environmental costs and it's got benefits. It's got pollution characteristics and other fossil fuels do. It's just another. It's not different from natural gas. It's the same stuff, right? It's just that some of it's in big holes and some of it percolates across. We want common regulation and then work out when it might be sensible to develop natural gas, when it might be sensible to develop non. And that links to the final point, which is about this, the link to renewables. Okay, the difference between me and Jason is actually really about one relatively, I think you'll maybe disagree, and please do, a relatively narrow thing. I don't believe that current wind technologies and current solar panels can solve climate change. I take the David Mackay view. There isn't enough land, there isn't enough water, and I take a very different view about the cost. The truth is that people always tell us that renewables costs are going down, but they assume that gas prices are going up. Actually, the big technical changes have been on the fossil fuels keeping pace. And I think that it's the next generation of renewables that really will wipe the floor of these things. Next generation solar, the graphene, the 3D printing, the batteries, the storage, etc. And indeed, if they won't, we're stuffed. Right? It's not as if it's a choice. And the relative cost of pursuing the development of those technologies, given that people's willingness and ability to pay is limited, is very low compared with the hundreds or tens of billions spent on current renewables. It's about opening up the light spectrum. It's about using new materials like graphene. You don't learn those by plastering the roofs with current solar panels. Okay? And I defy anyone to think how particularly offshore wind, could ever be economic against those new technologies, let alone against the other fuels that are available. And that's why I would not spend 100 billion on offshore wind. Spend 50, it's still to me a silly number, but spend 2 billion on R&D. That would be the biggest research project in Europe, 2 billion. We can't spend 1 billion on a CCS plant. This is why we're not really serious about climate change in Europe. And shale gas is just another fuel in the pitch. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not a solution. It's just another fuel that we ought to be serious about and analysing how it works and the price effects that come from it.
Jason, very briefly, if you want to come back on any of those points.
And other things as well.
I don't think that you're going to have a next generation of renewable energy that springs to scale in the market from the laboratory. We have actually far more value in renewable energy value chains, aside from the piece of technology that you put on your roof or out in a field. And you need to develop those robustly. We're now not even yet at 20% of European energy coming from renewable energy. And the Commission has the ambition, a very modest ambition of 27% by 2030. So we can easily achieve those with this first generation technology. But what we're doing in doing so is actually creating the know-how and the market conditions for the next generation to enter in. Fracking, shale gas, comes out of decades of development and previous conditions, particularly in North America. You wouldn't imagine that for the fossil fuel industry. You certainly shouldn't imagine it for the renewable energy industry.
Okay, because we've got to get some more questions. I'm sorry. Yeah.
If I might just add, I want to just make the point that fracking is not a fossilized technology either. It's going to move, and it has moved dramatically.
That's true.
There may well be ways of doing this without water, for example. Lots of different things that can be done. A much more focused, much more delicate approach to where fracking takes place. So none of these technologies are static. They just need supporting. I agree with both these points that you both need to deploy technology, but we also need to add a lot more to the R&D for renewables. But we need to do both at once.
Okay, I'm going to take the question there from David and then the chat behind him briefly afterwards.
David Odling, Oil and Gas UK. Europe already imports vast amounts of gas. And that's
briefly, if you could, David. Sorry, we're running out of time. Yeah.
This country is now a 50% importer of gas. We seem to forget that the main use of gas in Europe is heat. The debate nearly always degenerates into a discussion about electricity. Conversion of gas into heat is one of the most efficient transitions from primary to user energy in existence. Why on earth would we not produce our own gas if we can, given the amount of demand there is for heat, regardless of electricity?
Okay, hold that thought, and then gentleman just behind you.
Thank you very much. General Tim Cross. I'm interested from a defence and security perspective. Every time I come to one of these debates, we're stuffed is about what I leave the room thinking about, because we seem to have no link here.
We don't aim for that.
My question, though, is I came thinking we had a feel for how much potential there is for gas in this country through fracking. I think I've heard both speakers say we really don't know. We need to dig some wells and find out. Yep. Do we have a real sense of what the potential is in this country to be self-sufficient if we were to frack?
Neil Brown on the potential?
So we have an idea. We have a lot of things which give us an idea of what the potential is. And we have a lot of ideas all over the world like that. What we now need to do is we now need to figure out how much can be produced economically and how fast, which means that wells need to be drilled and they need to be fracked. And there's no other way then of finding something which you can rely upon. That's it.
Jason, what about this heat point that David made? I mean, we've talked a lot about electricity and electricity generation, but even in, some pretty aggressive decarbonisation scenarios, we're going to be using a lot of gas for heat going forward. Is that?
I appreciate the fact that was brought up, because you're absolutely right that gets overlooked. One of the important things to bear in mind about the use of gas for heat is that we have a very important alternative for reducing the amount of gas that's used in heat, and indeed fuel, oil, and other sources, which is energy efficiency. And our main challenge in Europe is how to renovate the 80% of buildings that were built before we had proper standard on insulation. That is a huge challenge. But it does mean that in any scenario moving forward, because of the increase in energy efficiency, the absolute amount of gas demand in Europe will decline over time, because we're able to be more efficient with our use of energy. That is, all of the European Commission 2050 scenarios have an absolute reduction in gas demand.
Do you want to come back on that briefly, Dieter?
I just think, energy efficiency is a great idea. By definition, it's a good thing to do. But never make the mistake of thinking increase in energy efficiency reduce demand for energy. They probably increase it. They have done for 200 years. Because what energy efficiency does is lower the relative cost of energy, and therefore effectively it's relatively priced. And 101 economics tells you that if you lower the cost or price of something, then the substitution effect must always be negative, and therefore demand will rise unless there's a compensating income effect. And never underestimate the capacity to put air conditioning, 3D printers, all the kind of things that people will be able to consume with the income left. So great energy efficiency. As to the scenarios which have a falling demand, this is a delusion. Have a look at the numbers from the US for last year. US demand for oil went up substantially. This is a cyclical, not a structural adjustment of the relationship between energy and GDP. And what's more, the miles per gallon fell. Right? And that's exactly what you'd expect in an economic upturn when the economy starts to grow at 3% per annum. If people in Europe think either A, it's actually a good idea to reduce the demand for energy, we want to reduce the demand for carbon energy, but if you found a solar source like Next Generation using graphite and stuff, which was really cheap, you'd want to use as much as possible. It's not doing any environmental harm, right? Okay, but B, to base an energy policy or a price prediction, which I heard Ed Davies say on Hard Talk on the middle of January, the idea that energy efficiency is going to so reduce the amount of units that people buy that bills are going to go down to consumers despite the rising costs of renewables. This is nonsense. This is the kind of delusionary energy policy which leads you in trouble. And the United States, an example. Remember, the GDP to energy demand relationship is overwhelmingly cyclical, and demand relates to price. Put the price up and demand will fall. The best thing that's driving down the demand for energy at the moment is rising energy prices and actually the very expensive renewables, because that makes it expensive. That's why people do energy efficiency. But don't think that energy efficiency leads to a reduction in demand. It's nonsense and a very, very big myth to put into energy policy mixes, and dangerous, because when it doesn't happen, you've got no levers left to compensate for the consequences that follow.
Okay, I'm going to take a last round of questions. Okay, I'm going to take, no Jonathan, no chance. I'm going to take that lady there, that gentleman there, and that guy by the door who's been waiting patiently for a while. Sorry, I know. Very, very brief questions, please, because you have no time to ask.
Jeremy Thomas, how far would the problems of public acceptability be reduced by hypothecating tax revenue from shale gas extraction and putting the proceeds into a sovereign wealth fund, as was done in a smaller economy such as Norway? If they can do it...
That's fine. We've got it. Sovereign wealth fund, yep.
Catherine McWhirter from Bolcombe, one of the sacrificial communities, one of the 40 that you're hoping to frack. You say you want to get rid of some of the myths that are going around at the moment. I'd like to address one myth that you have...
Briefly, please, Catherine, so we're running out of time.
methane, you say that it's a low carbon fuel. How aware are you of the research, the peer-reviewed research that there has been recently in the USA, in Harvard, Texas, Colorado, Cornell, elsewhere, showing that up to 8% fugitive methane undermines the claims that methane is a low-carbon fuel and preferable, therefore, to coal?
Okay, so that's a fugitive methane undoing any potential benefits. Very briefly, over to the chap by the door.
Hi, I'm Spanish, and in Spain the energy sector is overregulated. The support to clean energies, it costs us like 40,000 million euros.
Question, please,
So
very quickly.
how well can do the shale gas in the free market?
Sorry, I'm not sure I got that question, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, clean energies works in Spain because they are supported by the government. Could the shale could the shale gas be in the market without any help from the government?
Okay,
Yeah.
can it exist without subsidy? And I will take that gentleman because I realised he's had his hand up the whole way through and I've been ignoring him studiously.
Thank you. Oliver Van Heel with the Aldersgate Group. The question relates to the argument that Dieter was making. Basically, we have to go for shale because the alternative is carbon, because renewables are not going to be cost effective for the foreseeable future. That's, I think I'm paraphrasing accurately. Given that the government has made an estimate of future energy prices based on the Hinkley Point case, where you would see clearly that they believe prices are going to rise to a level that is already below, so is already above renewable prices. Why are renewables not part of the equation? I don't understand.
Okay, I'll start with Lord Brown, and particularly on that point about Balcom maybe and from Catherine from Balcom and the methane studies.
Thank you for the question. I've seen these studies. They are very controversial. They are not agreed by many people. The fact about fugitive emissions, in my own experience, I did this when I was running BP. I reduced fugitive emissions down to negligible levels simply by good practice and tightening up valves and having different operating practice. Actually, even when the price of gas was $1, we estimated that it made a positive contribution to profits of some $600 million just by doing that. And it's easy to do. It requires careful but just standard operating practice. Shale gas, the cost is estimated to be around $5 to $6 an MCF in Europe, so it can easily be produced without subsidy. The selling price of gas is variously between $10 and $12 an MCF.
Jason, and final comments on this?
I'd just like to point out that the recent study on cost of prices in Europe indicate that Spanish retail prices have fallen as a result of the suppression of wholesale prices, counterbalancing the increase in direct payments for renewable energy. It's just a different way of compensating, and in some countries like Germany, they've overcompensated indeed, but it's just a different dynamic in the energy market that the current energy market isn't prepared for. So it's a much more complicated story than that. On methane emissions... But
it's the retail prices that matter, though, isn't it? I mean, it's the retail prices that people are paying.
The retail price is very complicated, but nevertheless, it's not a straightforward case of subsidy increasing prices because of the depressing effects.
It does have some depressing effects, yeah.
And so big cost to the utilities sitting on all this debt that is customer bills that weren't passed through.
Sorry, Jason, let finish your...
On methane emissions, there's a very low tolerance for methane emissions. The US EPA estimates that you can have 3.2% emissions before you actually become as emitting as coal. And they say that in the US it's about 2.4% on average, but there are a number of studies contesting that. And I think the question is what do the high emitting ones have in common? What do the low emitting ones have in common? And what do you estimate is the likelihood that on average you're going to actually retain very low emissions? The jury is still out on that, but if you were to want to have very low emissions, the thing that you need to have is what you do not have in the UK or around Europe, which is a very stringent regulatory regime that is not primarily voluntary and has external people coming in and actually inspecting and making sure that there's monitoring and enforcement, because it's very complicated to do well.
You're really totally unconfident of the regulatory regimes across Europe, in the UK included?
I think it's been designed with offshore in mind. It's been jury-rigged to work onshore, but it's not there yet.
Okay, Dieter, I'm sorry, we could get back into that, but we're running out of time.
Okay. Yeah. We don't have to do shale gas. That's not what I said. I said I do hold the view that you can't do a transition to low carbon technologies without some gas. And I think actually everyone agrees with that. Okay? It can be natural gas, it can be shale gas. Okay? What I say is put shale gas on the same platform or footing as the other fossil fuels, same price of carbon, same methane treatment, etc. And then let's see what happens. I do think it's worth drilling some holes to find out how much there is there, by the way. That seems to me an extremely sensible thing to do. The argument was that you have to deploy renewables technology. Well, you do have to drill some holes to find out what's there. You might decide to do nothing as a result. But it's not, I'm not in favour of shale gas per se. It's just do it on a consistent basis. And I do think gas has some substitution value vis-a-vis coal on the route to a low-carbon future. I just don't happen to think the low-carbon future is current solar panels and windmills. I'm very much more optimistic about a number of the other things. I disagree about the deployment, but hey, you know, orders of magnitude. 100 billion versus 1 billion between R&D and deployment. If you want to spend 50 billion deploying it and give me 50 billion for R&D for graphene, 3D printing, new batteries, solar film, nanowires, etc., just give me just 2 or 3 billion of that and I might make some impact on the outcome. Okay? Subsidy free, yeah, fine. Compensation principle, definitely. That's what the Sovereign Wealth Fund is. It's a compensation to future generations of using a non-renewable resource. That's what fossil fuels are. They're non-renewable. Someone will use them this generation or the next. It's compensation. And that's why I like the compensation principle generally. On the methane point, it's an empirical point. Okay? I don't agree with you that methane leakages from lignite and coal mines are less than methane leakages from properly regulated fracking wells. But if it's true, then there's an obvious implication. You could think of having a price for methane, but I'm with the argument that you must have proper regulation of that, but consistently. And I do hold the view that if we're talking about Europe, I find it incredible that the Europeans can ban fracking and promote coal. You just couldn't make that up. And that's the consistent outcome of the logic of the policies they've pursued and the impact of the renewables on the EU ETS to produce this ludicrous carbon price which provides no spark spread between gas and coal for a proper substitution. So I think you have to be a bit pragmatic. You have to not be in an all or nothing. And as I think Philip Lowe put it at the Commission, he said, you know, there's that advert that says if you're in favour of this, you know, this book, you'll like that one. In the energy sector, if you don't like this one, you won't like that one. And actually, there's some decisions that have to be made. If the lights go out, you can forget about the population supporting climate change adjustment. Right? If the bills go too high because it costs so much for the renewables, they'll revolt. Right across Europe, they're cutting the subsidies. Right across Europe, electricity bills are high up on the scale.
Or the nuclear.
And you end up the consequences. So one has to have a pragmatic frame, and I would say shale gas is neither the bee's knees nor the evil incarnate. Get consistent regulation, drill some holes, find out what the alternatives are, but for goodness sake, get on with the dealing with the coal as fast as you possibly can.
Brilliant. We're going to have to end there. We've already run over time. I think the one safe conclusion is that this debate won't finish here and we'll continue on in various different forums. But I think that's been an excellent discussion. I thank all of you for the excellent questions. But I'd invite you to thank our panel for a wonderful discussion.